The moment Mei Lin's husband died, his debts became hers. Standing in the center of Copperfield's main street with 40 pairs of eyes watching, she knew three things. She had no money, no family, and nowhere left to run. When Marcus Blackwell stepped forward with his ledger and his smirk, demanding payment or servitude, the crowd pressed closer, hungry for her humiliation. Then a voice cut through the noise like winter wind, low, steady, unmoved. "How much does she owe?" Every head turned toward the man in the shadow of the livery stable. Caleb Boone had spoken. "If you want to see where courage leads when the whole world says no, stay with me until the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels." The spring of 1887 came to Copperfield, Wyoming territory, the way it always did, late, reluctant, and wrapped in mud. The mountains still wore their caps of snow, and the cottonwoods along Bitter Creek had barely begun to bud when Mei Lin's world collapsed for the second time in as many months. The first collapse had been quiet, private. It happened in the cabin she'd shared with her husband, Jacob Chen, when his breathing finally stopped in the hour before dawn, and the room filled with a silence so complete it felt like drowning. She'd sat beside him until the light came, holding his cooling hand, and when the undertaker arrived, he'd looked at her with something between pity and discomfort, as if he wasn't quite sure what to do with a Chinese widow in a town that barely tolerated Chinese laborers. The second collapse was anything but private. It happened on a Tuesday in the middle of Main Street, with half the town watching. Mei Lin had been walking back from the general store, her arms full of the last supplies she could afford, flour, a tin of lard, matches, when Marcus Blackwell stepped into her path. He was a thick-necked man with hands like hammocks and a face that never quite committed to any expression except mild cruelty. He owned the freight company, the feed store, and according to some, a decent percentage of the souls in Copperfield. "Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice loud enough to carry, "we need to have a conversation." Mei Lin stopped. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, her black hair pulled severely back from a face that had learned not to show what it felt. She wore the same gray dress she'd been wearing for weeks, mended at the elbows, the hem dark with trail dust. "Mr. Blackwell," she said quietly. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and shook it open with theatrical precision. "Your husband, Jacob Chen, owed my company $217 for freight services rendered over the past 8 months. Tools shipped from Sacramento, seed, lumber for that cabin you're living in." He paused, letting the sum hang in the air. "That debt doesn't die with him, Mrs. Chen. It transfers." The street had gone still. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A wagon halted. Even the dog seemed to pause. Mei Lin's throat tightened, but her voice stayed level. "I was not aware of this debt." "Ignorance doesn't erase obligation." Blackwell stepped closer. "You got 3 options. Pay in full by week's end. Sign a work contract to settle it over time. Or get out of that cabin and off land you got no right to anymore." She felt the weight of every gaze. Shopkeepers in doorways. Women with baskets. Cowboys leaning against hitching posts. She saw calculation in some eyes, amusement in others, and in a few, just a few, something that might have been sympathy but wouldn't translate into help. "I will need time," she said. "You've had time. Your husband's been cold 6 weeks. Then I will work. I can cook, clean, mend. You'll work for me then, at the freight yard, sorting cargo, cleaning wagons, whatever I need. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, at $1 a day. That means you'll be clear in about 7 months, assuming you don't eat much." A few men chuckled. Mei Lin's hands tightened around her parcels until the burlap of the flour sack creased under her fingers. "That is not reasonable," she said. "Reasonable?" Blackwell's eyebrows rose. "You think you're in a position to negotiate? You got no family, no friends, no money. Hell, half this town thinks you shouldn't even be here in the first place." He leaned in, his breath sour with tobacco. "You'll take what I offer, or you'll find out what happens to women with debts and no protectors." Mei Lin's pulse hammered in her ears, but she kept her chin level. She would not beg. She would not break. Not here. Not in front of them. And then a voice, quiet and cold as deep water, cut through the tension. "How much does she owe?" Every head turned. Caleb Boone stood in the shadow of the livery stable, one shoulder leaning against the frame, his hat brim low enough to hide most of his face. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked land and horses. His clothes worn but clean, his boots scarred by years of use. He didn't move, didn't step forward. He just stood there, waiting. Blackwell's expression flickered. Annoyance, maybe a trace of uncertainty. "This doesn't concern you, Boone." "Didn't ask if it concerned me. Asked how much he owes." $217. Caleb was silent for a moment, his gaze steady and unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Then he pushed off from the frame and walked forward, his boot heels striking the packed earth with slow, deliberate rhythm. The crowd parted without thinking. He stopped a few feet from Blackwell, close enough that the freight owner had to tilt his head back slightly to hold eye contact. "You always this loud when you collect?" Caleb asked. Blackwell's jaw tightened. "It's a public debt. Public business." "Public humiliation, you mean?" Caleb's tone didn't rise, but something in it made the air feel colder. "You could have gone to her door. Instead, you dragged her out here like a spectacle." "She's got no one to vouch for her, Boone. No collateral. You got a right to be paid. That's all." Caleb turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Mei Lin's. They were gray, storm-colored, unreadable but not unkind. "Ma'am, you got anyone who can help with this?" Mei Lin's throat closed. She wanted to say yes, wanted to have a name, a friend, a lifeline, but there was only silence and the truth. "No," she said quietly. Caleb nodded once, as if that confirmed something he'd already known. Then he turned back to Blackwell. "I'll cover it." The street erupted into murmurs. Blackwell blinked, momentarily thrown. "You'll what?" "I'll cover her debt. $217. I'll have the bank draft you a payment by end of business today." Blackwell's face darkened. "Why the hell would you do that?" "Because I can. She's nothing to you. She's someone who doesn't deserve to be cornered in the street like an animal." Caleb's voice was still quiet, but it carried an edge now, sharp as a skinning knife. "You'll get your money, Blackwell. That square things?" For a moment, Blackwell looked like he might argue. But Caleb Boone wasn't a man you argued with lightly. He didn't brawl in saloons or make loud threats, but everyone in Copperfield knew he'd built his ranch from nothing, survived winters that killed livestock and men alike, and once rode 3 days through a blizzard to bring back a doctor for a neighbor's child. He was respected. Feared even. In the way quiet men with unshakable principles often are. Blackwell stuffed the paper back into his coat. "Fine, but if you're taking on her debt, that's your business. Don't come crying to me if she skips town." "She won't." Blackwell shot Mei Lin a last venomous look, then turned and stalked back toward his office. The crowd began to disperse, slowly, reluctantly, murmuring as they went. Mei Lin stood frozen, her parcels still clutched against her chest, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She looked at Caleb Boone, the stranger who had just altered the course of her life with a handful of words, and felt a dizzying mix of gratitude, confusion, and something dangerously close to fear. He met her gaze, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "No," he agreed, "but I did." "Why?" Caleb considered the question, his expression unreadable. Then he tipped his hat back slightly, just enough for her to see his face fully. Weathered, lined at the corners of his eyes, but honest. "Because nobody should have to stand alone like that," he said. "Not if there's another choice." Mei Lin felt something crack open inside her chest, some wall she'd built to survive the past 6 weeks. She blinked hard, willing herself not to cry in the middle of Main Street. "I cannot repay you," she said. "Didn't ask you to." "Then what do you want?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Come with me, out to my ranch. I'll give you work, honest work, fair wages, room and board included. You can pay me back over time if it sits better with you, or you can just work and save and figure out what comes next. Your choice." Mei Lin stared at him, searching his face for deception, for the trap she'd been taught to expect. But all she saw was tired sincerity and something that looked almost like loneliness. "I don't know you," she said. "No, ma'am, you don't." "You could be—" She stopped herself, but he seemed to understand. "I could be a lot of things," Caleb said quietly. "But I'm not asking you to trust me blind. I'm asking you to take a chance on something better than what Blackwell was offering. If you don't like it, you leave. No strings. She wanted to say no. Wanted to be strong enough to refuse charity, to walk away with her pride intact, but pride didn't fill an empty stomach. Pride didn't keep the wind out. When? She asked. Now, if you're willing. I've got a wagon around back. Maylin looked down at the parcels in her arms. The last of her money, spent on supplies she might not even need now. Then she looked back at Caleb Boone, this stranger with storm-gray eyes and a voice like distant thunder. All right, she said. The Boone Ranch sat 7 miles west of Copperfield, tucked into a wide valley where Bitter Creek curled through stands of cottonwood and willow. The house was large, larger than Maylin had expected, built from hewn logs and river stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides and a chimney that rose like a sentinel against the mountains beyond. There were outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a chicken coop. Fences stretched toward the horizon, enclosing pastures where cattle grazed and horses stood like sculptures in the fading light. It was beautiful. It was also profoundly lonely. Caleb pulled the wagon up to the front porch and set the brake. For a moment he just sat there, looking at the house as if seeing it for the first time. It's big, he said, almost apologetically. Built it thinking I'd fill it. Never quite got around to that. Maylin climbed down, her legs stiff from the ride. She stood at the base of the steps, taking it all in. The solid craftsmanship, the careful details, the sense of something built to last. How long have you lived here? She asked. 12 years, came out here with nothing but a horse and a bedroll. Worked cattle drives, saved every cent. Bought the land in 75, started building in 76. He climbed down beside her, moving with the ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. It's been just me since. No family? Had a brother. He died of fever back in Kansas before we could head west together. Parents passed when I was young. He pulled her parcels from the wagon bed and handed them to her. Guess I got used to the quiet. Maylin took the parcels, her fingers brushing his briefly. I understand, she said softly. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw recognition in his eyes, the kind that passes between people who've both learned to survive alone. Come on, he said. I'll show you inside. The interior of this house was as well built as the exterior, but it had the unmistakable feel of a place inhabited by a man who didn't care much about comfort. The furniture was sturdy, but sparse. The floors were clean, but bare. The kitchen was functional, the pantry well stocked, but there were no curtains on the windows, no rugs, no softness anywhere. Caleb led her through the main room, past a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, and down a short hallway. This can be yours, he said, opening a door to reveal a small bedroom. It held a bed, a dresser, a chair, and a window that looked out over the valley. The bed was neatly made, the floor swept clean. I keep it ready in case I have help during branding season, but it's empty now. You'll have privacy, door locks from the inside. He said it plainly, without emphasis, but Maylin understood what he was promising. Safety, boundaries. Thank you, she said. He nodded. There's a washroom out back with a stove for heating water. Privy's about 20 yards past that. Chickens need feeding every morning. I'll show you where the feed is. Garden's overgrown, but if you've got a mind to tend it, you're welcome to whatever you grow. I usually eat simple: beans, bacon, cornbread. If you want to cook different, that's fine by me. Maylin set her parcels down on the bed. What do you want me to do? Whatever keeps the house running. Cooking, cleaning, mending, preserving food when the season turns. I'm out most days handling cattle, fixing fence, checking water. Means the house gets neglected. If you can manage it, that'd be worth plenty. And wages? $1 a day, same as Blackwell was offering. But you keep your room and board on top of that, and you eat what I eat. No skimping. It was more than fair. It was generous. Maylin felt the knot in her chest loosen just slightly. I'll work hard, she said. Didn't doubt it. Caleb glanced toward the window where the sun was sinking behind the mountains. I'll leave you to settle in. There's stew on the stove if you're hungry. Help yourself. He turned to go, but she stopped him. Mr. Boone. He paused, looking back. Why did you really do this? She asked. In town. You didn't have to step in. Caleb was quiet for a moment, his expression distant. Then he said, "Because I know what it's like to have the world decide you don't matter. And I know what one person's kindness can mean when you're standing in that place." He tipped his hat. "Get some rest, Mrs. Chen. Morning comes early." And then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hall. Mei Lin stood alone in the small, clean room, and for the first time in 6 weeks, she let herself breathe. The work began before dawn. Mei Lin woke to the sound of Caleb moving through the house. Boots on wood, the creak of the stove door, the clatter of a coffee pot. By the time she dressed and emerged, he was already outside feeding the horses. The sky was still more dark than light, stars fading reluctantly into the coming day. She found the chicken feed where he'd said it would be and scattered it across the yard, watching the hens emerge in a flurry of feathers and clucking chaos. Then she went inside and started breakfast. It had been years since she'd cooked for anyone but Jacob, and longer still since she'd had a kitchen this well supplied. She made biscuits from scratch, fried eggs and bacon, boiled coffee strong enough to strip paint. When Caleb came in, he stopped in the doorway, staring at the table as if he'd walked into the wrong house. "Didn't expect all this," he said. "You're paying me to manage the house," Mei Lin replied, setting a plate in front of him. "This is part of it." He sat down slowly, almost cautiously, and took a bite of biscuit. His eyebrows rose. "This is good," he said, surprise clear in his voice. "You sound shocked." "I am. Haven't had a biscuit that didn't come from a tin in about 5 years." Mei Lin allowed herself the smallest smile. "Then I'll make them often." They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Outside, the valley brightened degree by degree, the mountains sharpening into focus, the creek glittering like scattered coins. Caleb finished his plate, drained his coffee, and stood. "I'll be out checking the north fence line today," he said. "Probably won't be back till near dark. If you need anything, there's a bell on the porch. Ring it, and I'll hear." "I'll be fine." He nodded, grabbed his hat, and left. Mei Lin spent the day learning the rhythms of the house. She swept floors, washed windows, scrubbed the stove until it gleamed. She found linens in a chest and aired them in the sun. She discovered a sewing kit and set about mending a pile of shirts Caleb had clearly been ignoring for months. By the time evening came, her back ached and her hands were raw, but the house felt different. Lived in, cared for. When Caleb returned, he stopped just inside the door and looked around, his expression unreadable. "You've been busy," he said. "I told you I'd work." "Didn't think you meant you'd transform the place in one day." Mei Lin wiped her hands on her apron. "It's not finished." Wasn't a complaint. He hung his hat on a peg and moved toward the kitchen, where she'd set out supper, venison stew, cornbread, canned peaches. He sat down, and again she saw that flicker of something in his face. Surprise. Maybe gratitude. "You keep cooking like this, I'm going to get soft," he said. "You don't look soft." He almost smiled. "Give it time." The days fell into a pattern. Caleb rose before dawn, worked the land until dusk, came home to a clean house and a hot meal. Mei Lin cleaned, cooked, mended, and slowly began to reclaim the overgrown garden, pulling weeds and turning soil, planting seeds she'd brought from her old cabin. They spoke little, but the silence between them was easy, companionable. 3 weeks after she arrived, a storm rolled in from the mountains. It came fast, the way spring storms do, turning the sky from blue to bruised in less than an hour. Caleb was in the barn when the first drops fell, and Mei Lin was in the garden, frantically pulling seedlings under cover. By the time she reached the porch, the rain was falling in sheets, and thunder cracked like breaking bones. She was soaked, shivering, when Caleb appeared from the barn at a dead run. "Mare's foaling," he shouted over the storm. "Early, she's in trouble." Mei Lin didn't hesitate. She followed him back into the rain, across the yard to the barn, where a chestnut mare lay on her side in the straw, her flanks heaving, her eyes rolling white with fear. "She's been laboring too long," Caleb said, kneeling beside her. "Foal's stuck. I need to turn it, but I need her steady. Can you hold her head?" Mei Lin dropped to her knees in the straw, heedless of the mud and blood, and pressed her hands to the mare's neck, murmuring softly in Cantonese, words of comfort, of encouragement. The mare's breathing slowed just slightly, and Caleb moved with swift, practiced precision, reaching in, adjusting, guiding. The storm raged. Lightning turned the barn white. Thunder shook the walls. And then, impossibly, the foal came. It slid into the world wet and trembling, and Caleb pulled it clear, clearing its nose, rubbing it with straw until it coughed and gasped. The mare lifted her head, nickering low and urgent, and Caleb guided the foal toward her. Within moments, it was nuzzling against her, searching for warmth. Caleb sat back on his heels, breathing hard, his shirt soaked with rain and sweat, and worse. Mei Lin was still on her knees, her hands shaking, her heart pounding. "We did it," she whispered. Caleb looked at her, and for the first time since they'd met, he smiled, a real smile, tired and genuine and full of wonder. "Yeah," he said, "we did." Outside, the storm began to ease, the thunder rolling away into the distance. Inside the barn, the mare cleaned her foal, and Mei Lin and Caleb sat together in the straw, exhausted and alive, bound by something neither of them could name, but both of them felt. The foal was on its feet within the hour, gangly and uncertain, its wet coat already beginning to dry into soft copper. Caleb named her Storm, and Mei Lin thought it fitting. Born in thunder, delivered through struggle, alive because two people had refused to let the night win. They walked back to the house through mud that sucked at their boots, the rain reduced now to a whisper against the earth. Mei Lin's dress clung to her like a second skin, heavy and cold, and she could feel Caleb's eyes on her once or twice, though he never said anything. When they reached the porch, he stopped. "You should get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I'll bring in more wood for the fire." She nodded, too tired to argue, and went inside. Her room felt like a sanctuary. She peeled off the soaked dress, the ruined stockings, and wrapped herself in a blanket while her spare clothes warmed by the small stove Caleb had installed in her room during the second week. Outside, she could hear him moving around, the thunk of logs being stacked, the creak of the porch boards under his weight. When she emerged 20 minutes later, dressed in dry wool and with her hair braided down her back, the main room had been transformed. Caleb had built up the fire until it roared, filling the space with heat and light. He'd changed too, into clean denims and a flannel shirt, his hair still damp and pushed back from his forehead. He stood at the stove, heating water for coffee, and when he saw her, he gestured toward the table. "Sit," he said. "You earned it tonight." "So did you." "I'm used to it. You're not." She wanted to protest, but her legs were shaking and her hands wouldn't stop trembling, so she sat. Caleb poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought them over, then lowered himself into the chair across from her with a grunt that spoke of aching muscles and too many years of hard work. For a long while, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, drinking coffee that was too hot and too strong, listening to the fire snap and the rain fade into silence. "I was afraid we'd lose them both," Mei Lin said finally, her voice quiet. Caleb nodded. "Me too. Mare's 8 years old. Best horse I've got. Losing her would have—" He stopped, shook his head. "Would have been hard. You knew what to do. Learned from a vet down in Cheyenne years back. Helped him with a dozen births before I felt steady enough to try it myself." He took a long drink of coffee. "Still scares me every time." Mei Lin looked at him across the table, this man who'd walked into her disaster of a life and offered a way forward without asking for anything in return. His face was lined with fatigue, shadows pooling under his eyes, but there was something else there too, something that looked almost like contentment. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me help." Caleb's gaze met hers, steady and unguarded. "Couldn't have done it without you. She needed steadying. You gave her that." "I only held her." "That's not nothing." He set his cup down, his fingers curling around the warm tin. "Most people would have stayed in the house, stayed dry. You didn't even hesitate." Mei Lin felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "I've seen animals suffer. I don't like it." "Neither do I." The words hung in the air between them, simple and honest, and Mei Lin realized with a start that she believed him. In the months she'd been here, she'd watched Caleb work himself to exhaustion, fixing a fence so the cattle wouldn't wander onto a neighbor's land and cause trouble. She'd seen him spend an entire afternoon coaxing a skittish colt to take an apple from his hand. She'd heard him talk to his horses the way other men talk to family, with patience, with respect, with affection that didn't need to announce itself. He was not what she'd expected when she climbed into his wagon that day in Copperfield. He was quieter, kinder, lonelier. You should sleep, Caleb said, breaking the silence. Tomorrow's Sunday. You can rest if you want.
What will you do? Same as always. Animals don't take Sundays off. Maylin stood, carrying her empty cup to the wash basin. Then neither will I. She felt him watching her as she rinsed the cup, set it to dry, and turned back toward the hallway. At the doorway, she paused. Caleb? It was the first time she'd used his given name. She saw him register it, saw something shift in his expression. Yeah? I'm glad you were there. Tonight? In town. All of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, So am I. She went to her room and closed the door, and for the first time since Jacob died, she slept without nightmares. Spring gave way to early summer with the kind of slow inevitability that marked all things in Wyoming. The snow retreated higher into the mountains. The creek ran fast and clear. The garden Maylin had planted began to show green. She worked it every morning after the chickens were fed, kneeling in the dirt with her hands deep in the soil, and Caleb would sometimes pause on his way to the pastures to watch her. He never said anything, but she could feel his presence like a weight against her back, steady and undemanding. The town, however, was less forgiving. Maylin went into Copperfield only when necessary, once every 2 weeks usually, to purchase supplies Caleb couldn't produce on the ranch. He always offered to go himself, but she refused. She would not hide. She would not give them the satisfaction. But every trip was a gauntlet. The stares followed her from the moment she stepped off the wagon. Women in their Sunday dresses would turn away, clutching their baskets tighter as if proximity to Maylin might contaminate them. Men watched from doorways and porches, some with curiosity, others with something uglier. Children pointed and whispered until their mothers scolded them into silence. And then there was Blackwell. He made a point of being wherever she was. If she went to the general store, he'd be at the counter, making loud comments about the quality of goods or the reliability of customers. If she visited the feed store, he'd appear in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with eyes that held nothing but contempt. Still playing house with Boone? He asked one afternoon, his voice loud enough to carry across the street. Maylin ignored him, counting out coins for a sack of flour. Interesting arrangement you two got, Blackwell continued, stepping closer. Man alone, woman alone, real convenient. The storekeeper, a thin, nervous man named Hewitt, cleared his throat. That's enough, Marcus. I'm just making conversation, Hewitt. No harm in that. Blackwell leaned against the counter, his bulk crowding the space. Tell me, Mrs. Chen, does Boone know what he's getting for his charity, or is he still figuring that out? Maylin's hands stilled on the coins. She felt the air in the room tighten, felt Hewitt's discomfort, felt the attention of the other customers shift toward her like a predator's gaze. She could walk away. She could leave the flour, leave the store, leave Blackwell to his poison. That's what he expected. That's what he wanted. Instead, she looked up. Her eyes met Blackwell's, and she let him see nothing. No fear, no shame, no anger. Oh, just the flat, impassive stare of someone who had survived worse than him and would survive him too. Mr. Boone knows exactly what he's getting, she said quietly. An honest day's work for an honest day's wage. If you cannot understand that arrangement, perhaps the problem is not with us. Blackwell's face darkened. You got a smart mouth for someone living on borrowed time. And you have a loud one for someone who's already been paid. She pushed the coins across the counter to Hewitt. The debt is settled, Mr. Blackwell. You have no claim on me. You never did. She picked up the flour sack, turned, and walked out of the store with her spine straight and her head high. Behind her, she heard Blackwell curse, heard the scrape of a chair, but she didn't look back. She loaded the supplies into the wagon, climbed up onto the seat, and drove out of town without once letting her hands shake. It wasn't until she was 2 miles down the road, the town disappearing behind the curve of the hills, that she pulled the wagon to a stop and let herself breathe. Her hands were trembling now, her heart racing. She pressed her palms against her thighs and closed her eyes, willing the fear to pass. She had faced Blackwell down. She had stood her ground. But the cost of it was written in the adrenaline that flooded her veins, the nausea that churned in her stomach. She sat there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the grass, before she picked up the reins and continued home. Caleb was in the barn when she arrived, repairing a broken harness. He looked up when she drove the wagon into the yard, and something in her face must have shown, because he set down the leather and walked toward her.
What happened? He asked. Nothing. Mei Lin. She climbed down from the wagon, avoiding his eyes. Blackwell was at the store. He said things. I said things back. It's done. Caleb's jaw tightened. What did he say? It doesn't matter. It does to me. She finally looked at him, and the concern in his face, the genuine, unfiltered worry, made something in her chest crack open. He implied that our arrangement was improper, she said quietly. That you were taking advantage. Or that I was. Caleb's expression went cold, the kind of cold that came before a storm. He said that in public? In the store? In front of others? Did anyone defend you? Mei Lin shook her head. I defended myself. What did you say? That you know what you're getting. Honest work for honest wages. That the debt is settled and he has no claim. Caleb was silent for a moment, his gaze searching her face. Then unexpectedly, he smiled, a small, fierce smile that held more pride than amusement. Good, he said. That's good. He won't forget it. I don't care if he does. Caleb reached for the flour sack, lifting it easily from the wagon bed. Let him talk. Let all of them talk. They don't know you, and they don't know me, and their opinions don't change what's true. What's true? He set the sack down and turned to face her, his gray eyes steady. That you work harder than anyone I've ever known. That you've turned this house into a home. That I'm lucky you're here, and anyone who can't see that is a fool. Mei Lin felt her throat tighten, felt words rising that she didn't know how to say. So instead, she just nodded, and together they unloaded the wagon in silence that felt less like distance and more like understanding. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew. Caleb heard them in town when he went to buy seed, heard them at the livery when he got the horses shod, heard them in the land office when he filed paperwork. A Chinese woman living alone with a white rancher. No chaperone, no propriety. The scandal was too delicious for Copperfield to ignore. Some of the talk was cruel, some was merely curious. But all of it bothered Caleb in a way he hadn't expected. Not because he cared what they thought of him, he'd stopped caring about that years ago, but because he cared what it might do to Mei Lin. He saw the way she held herself when they went to town together, the way she made herself small and silent, as if by disappearing she could avoid their judgment. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes after every trip, the way she'd retreat to the garden and work until her hands bled, as if she could dig her way out of their contempt. And he hated it. One evening, about 6 weeks after the night storm was born, Caleb made a decision. They were sitting at the table after supper, the dishes washed and the lamps burning low, when he said, I'm going into town on Saturday, church social, I want you to come with me. Mei Lin looked up from the shirt she was mending, surprise clear on her face. Why? Because I'm tired of letting people talk without facing them. Facing them won't stop the talk. No, Caleb agreed. But it'll make a point. What point? That I'm not ashamed of you, that you're not hiding, that we've got nothing to apologize for. Mei Lin set down the needle, her hands folding in her lap. You don't have to do this. I know, but I want to. He leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. You stood up to Blackwell alone. You shouldn't have to keep doing that. Let me stand with you this time. She was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. Then she said, They'll say worse things if we go together. Let them. It could hurt your reputation. Caleb laughed, short and sharp. I don't have a reputation, Mei Lin. I'm the hermit on the hill who talks to horses and hasn't been to church in 3 years. They already think I'm half crazy. This won't change that. Then why go at all? He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Because you deserve to be seen as more than Blackwell's debtor or the Chinese widow. You deserve to be seen as the person you are. And if standing next to you in front of the whole town makes even one person think twice about their assumptions, then it's worth it. Mei Lin's expression softened, and for a moment she looked almost vulnerable, young, despite the hardness life had carved into her. All right, she said quietly. I'll go. Saturday came warm and clear, the kind of day that made you believe summer might actually arrive. Maylin dressed in her best, a simple blue dress she'd mended and pressed until it looked almost new, her hair pinned up with the ivory combs Jacob had given her on their wedding day. Caleb wore a clean shirt and his good hat, and when he helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand lingered on hers just a moment longer than necessary. The ride into town was quiet. Caleb didn't try to fill the silence with empty words, and Maylin was grateful for it. She needed the time to prepare herself, to build the walls she'd need to survive whatever came next. The church social was held in the yard behind the white clapboard chapel, under the shade of old cottonwood strung with lanterns. Tables had been set up, covered with food brought by the women of Copperfield, pies and cakes, fried chicken and biscuits, bowls of beans and corn. Children ran through the grass, their laughter bright and heedless. Men stood in clusters, smoking and talking. Women gathered near the tables, their voices a hum of gossip and judgment. When Caleb's wagon rolled into the yard, the noise didn't stop exactly, but it changed. Conversations faltered, heads turned, eyes tracked their approach like rifle sights. Caleb set the brake and climbed down, then turned and offered his hand to Maylin. She took it, feeling the rough warmth of his palm, the steadiness of his grip, and stepped down into the yard. Silence spread like ripples on water. Caleb didn't acknowledge it. He simply walked toward the tables with Maylin at his side, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. Not possessive, but present. Protective. Reverend Michaels, a tall man with kind eyes and thinning hair, was the first to break the spell. He stepped forward, his hand extended. "Caleb Boone," he said warmly. "It's been too long." Caleb shook his hand. "Reverend, good to see you." Michaels turned to Maylin, and his smile didn't waver. "And you must be Mrs. Chen. I've heard you're managing Caleb's household." "Yes," Maylin said quietly. "Well, we're glad to have you join us today." He gestured toward the tables. "Please, help yourselves. There's more food than we know what to do with." It was a small kindness, but it was enough to fracture the ice. A few people nodded in greeting. A woman Maylin didn't know offered a tentative smile. The conversations resumed, though the glances didn't stop. Caleb guided her toward the food, filled a plate for her and then one for himself, and they found a spot under one of the cottonwoods where they could sit and eat without being in the center of attention. For a while, it almost felt normal. Then Blackwell arrived. He came with two of his freight workers, thick-necked men who looked like they'd been carved from the same block of granite. Blackwell scanned the yard, and when his eyes landed on Caleb and Maylin, his expression twisted into something ugly. He crossed the yard with deliberate slowness, his boots heavy on the grass, and stopped a few feet from where they sat. "Well, well," he said, loud enough to carry. "Didn't expect to see you here, Boone. Thought you'd given up on civilization." Caleb set down his plate and stood, his movements calm but deliberate. "Blackwell. Brought your housekeeper, I see." Blackwell's gaze slid to Maylin, and the contempt in it was palpable. "Real cozy arrangement you two got? Does the Reverend know you're living in sin out there?" The yard went silent again. Every eye turned toward them. Caleb's voice, when he spoke, was quiet. So quiet that people had to strain to hear it. But there was steel underneath, cold and unyielding. "Mrs. Chen is my employee," he said. "She manages my house, cooks, cleans, and works harder in a day than most men do in a week. She's paid fair wages, has her own room, and is treated with the respect she deserves. If you've got a problem with that, Blackwell, say it plain." Blackwell's smile was sharp. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. A man and a woman, alone on a ranch, no one to vouch for her character. I vouch for her character." "You would. You're the one benefiting from the arrangement." Caleb took a step forward, and Blackwell's smile faltered. "Let me make something clear," Caleb said, his voice still quiet but vibrating with controlled fury. "Maylin Chen is under my protection. That means anyone who disrespects her, insults her, or tries to harm her answers to me. You understand?" Blackwell's face flushed red. "You threatening me, Boone?" "I'm making a promise." For a long, tense moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Reverend Michaels stepped between them, his hands raised. "Gentlemen," he said firmly, "this is a church social, a place of fellowship. Whatever grievances you have, they can be addressed elsewhere." Blackwell sneered but stepped back. "Sure, Reverend. Wouldn't want to disturb the fellowship. He shot Caleb one last venomous look, then turned and walked away, his men following. The yard slowly came back to life, conversations resuming in low, urgent tones. Caleb turned back to Mei Lin, and she saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not anger, but a kind of fierce protectiveness that made her heart ache. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her hands were shaking. "Yes. We can leave if you want." "No." She stood, meeting his eyes. "We stay." And they did. They stayed through the afternoon, through the awkward glances and the whispered conversations, through the uncertainty of people who didn't know what to make of them. And when they finally climbed back into the wagon as the sun was setting, Mei Lin felt something shift inside her. Not safety, exactly, but the possibility of it. Caleb didn't say anything on the ride home. He just drove, his hand steady on the reins, his presence a solid, unshakable thing beside her. And when they reached the ranch and he helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingered on hers again. And this time, she didn't pull away. The silence that followed them home was different from the silence that had carried them into town. It held weight now, texture, the shape of things unsaid but deeply felt. Caleb unhitched the horses while Mei Lin went inside to light the lamps, and when he came in 20 minutes later, she had coffee waiting and was slicing bread at the counter with hands that had finally stopped shaking. He hung his hat on the peg and stood there for a moment, watching her. The lamplight caught the dark silk of her hair, the curve of her neck, the careful precision of her movements. She looked smaller somehow in the warm glow of the kitchen, more fragile than he knew her to be, and something in his chest tightened. "You didn't have to do that," she said without turning around. "What you said to Blackwell." "Yes, I did." "He'll make trouble for you now." Caleb crossed to the table and sat down, his body heavy with the day's tension. "Blackwell's been trying to make trouble for me since I bought my first acre of land. This doesn't change anything." Mei Lin turned then, the knife still in her hand, her eyes searching his face. "It changes everything. You claimed me in front of the whole town. You said I was under your protection." "You are." "But what does that mean?" Caleb met her gaze and held it. "It means exactly what I said. You're safe here. You're valued here. And anyone who tries to hurt you will have to go through me first." She set the knife down slowly, her fingers trembling against the wooden handle. "I didn't ask for that." "I know. I'm giving it anyway." "Why?" The question hung between them, simple and impossible. Caleb knew the answer, had known it for weeks now, maybe longer. But saying it out loud would change things in ways he wasn't sure either of them was ready for. "Because you deserve it," he said finally. "Because you've had to fight alone for too long. Because—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "Because I want to." Mei Lin's breath hitched, almost imperceptibly, and she looked away. "People will think that we're more than employer and employee." "I know. It will ruin your reputation. I told you I don't care about that." "You should." Her voice was fierce now, edged with something that sounded almost like anger. "You've built a life here, a good life. You shouldn't risk it for me." Caleb stood, and the movement brought him closer to her, close enough that he could see the pulse beating fast at the base of her throat, the way her hands gripped the edge of the counter as if it were the only thing holding her upright. "Let me decide what I'm willing to risk," he said quietly. For a long moment, they stood there in the lamplight, the space between them charged with everything they weren't saying. Then Mei Lin turned away, her shoulders rigid. "I should finish the bread," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Caleb wanted to push, wanted to close the distance and make her look at him, make her see what he was trying so hard not to say. But he knew better. Mei Lin had been cornered too many times, by circumstances and by men who wanted things from her she couldn't give. He wouldn't be another one. "All right," he said. "I'll be outside if you need me." He left before she could respond, stepping out into the cool evening air where the stars were beginning to emerge, and the mountains stood dark against the sky. His hands were shaking, and he pressed them flat against the porch railing until the tremor stopped. He was in love with her. The realization wasn't new. It had been building for weeks, layering itself into the quiet rhythm of their days. But naming it made it real in a way that terrified him. Because Mei Lin Chen deserved more than a lonely rancher with rough hands and a house too big for one person. She deserved safety, yes, but also freedom. the freedom to choose her own path without obligation or debt weighing on every decision. And Caleb would give her that, even if it meant watching her walk away. Quote, Summer deepened, and the ranch fell into the cadence of long days and short nights. The cattle grew fat on good grass. The garden flourished under Mei Lin's careful attention, and Storm grew from a wobbly foal into a leggy yearling who followed Caleb around like a devoted shadow. The house itself seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath for years and could finally relax into the comfort of being lived in. But something had shifted between Caleb and Mei Lin since the church social. The easy companionship that had marked their first months together now carried an undercurrent of tension, a heightened awareness that made every accidental touch feel significant. They were more careful with each other now, more polite, and the distance hurt in ways neither of them could name. Mei Lin threw herself into work with renewed intensity. She rose before dawn and didn't stop until well after dark, scrubbing floors that were already clean, mending clothes that didn't need mending, preserving vegetables from the garden in endless rows of jars that lined the pantry shelves. She barely ate, barely slept, and when Caleb tried to tell her to rest, she just smiled and said she was fine. She wasn't fine. She was drowning. The problem was that she felt safe here. For the first time since Jacob died, maybe for the first time in her entire life, she felt like she had a place that was hers, work that mattered, a person who saw her as more than a burden or an obligation. And that terrified her, because safety could be taken away, homes could be lost, people could leave or die or change their minds, and then where would she be? Better not to want it too much. Better to keep working, keep moving, keep the walls high and the heart guarded. But it was getting harder. She noticed things now that she'd trained herself not to see. The way Caleb's hands moved when he worked leather, strong and sure. The sound of his voice when he talked to the horses, low and patient. The way he always made sure she ate before he did. The way he fixed the squeaky hinge on her door without being asked. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Like she was something precious and breakable that he was afraid to touch. It made her chest ache. It made her want things she had no right to want. One afternoon in late July, she was in the garden harvesting beans when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw Caleb riding in hard from the north pasture, his face grim. He pulled up near the fence, and she saw immediately that his left hand was wrapped in a bloody cloth. "What happened?" she called, already moving toward him. "Nothing, just a cut." "That's not nothing." She reached him as he dismounted, and when she took his hand to examine it, he winced. The cloth was soaked through, blood seeping between his fingers. "Wire snapped while I was fixing fence," he said. "Caught my palm. It's not deep." "Let me see." She led him to the porch and sat him down, then went inside for clean water and bandages. When she returned, he was leaning back against the post, his face pale under his tan, his jaw tight with pain he was trying not to show. Mei Lin knelt in front of him and carefully unwrapped the makeshift bandage. The cut ran across the meat of his palm, angry and deep, still bleeding sluggishly. It would need stitches. "This needs to be sewn," she said. "I'll ride into town tomorrow, have Doc Miller look at it." "You'll ride into town now, or I'll do it myself." Caleb blinked at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. "You know how to stitch?" "I stitched my husband's leg once when he cut it on a plow blade. He lived." She met his eyes. "I can do it if you trust me." He was quiet for a moment, searching her face. Then he nodded. "All right." She cleaned the wound first, working as gently as she could while Caleb sat rigid and silent, his free hand gripping the porch railing hard enough to make the wood creak. Then she threaded a needle with fine silk thread she'd been saving for delicate mending and began to stitch. Her hands were steady. She'd done this before, but the intimacy of it now, kneeling between Caleb's knees, holding his hand in hers, watching his face for signs of pain, felt different, felt dangerous. "Tell me something," she said, trying to distract both of them. "Why did you really come west?" Caleb's breath hissed through his teeth as she pulled the next stitch tight. "Told you already. My brother died. Had nothing keeping me in Kansas." "That's why you left. Not why you came here." He was quiet while she finished another stitch. Then he said, "Wanted to build something that was mine. Something that couldn't be taken away or burned down or lost to someone else's bad choices.
Figured land was the closest thing to permanent a man could get. And is it permanent? Land is. What you build on it, that's less certain. He paused. What about you? Why did Jacob come west? Maylin's hand stilled for just a moment before she continued working. He wanted to escape. His family in San Francisco didn't approve of our marriage. Thought I wasn't good enough, that I came from nothing. She smiled, but there was no humor in it. They were right about the second part.
You're not nothing. I was born in a fishing village in Guangdong. My parents sold me to a merchant family when I was 8 because they couldn't feed all their children. The merchant brought me to San Francisco when I was 12 to work in his household. She tied off another stitch, her voice flat and distant. Jacob was kind to me, the only person in that house who was. When he said he wanted to marry me and leave the city, I said yes, not because I loved him, but because I wanted to be free. Caleb's hand twitched in hers, but he didn't pull away. Did you? Love him, I mean. Eventually? Maylin considered the question as she worked, the needle flashing in the afternoon light. I cared for him. I was grateful to him. He gave me a name, a home, respect I'd never had before. But love? She shook her head. I don't think I knew what that was supposed to feel like. And now he's gone. And I feel guilty because mostly what I feel is relief that I don't have to be grateful anymore. The words came out raw and honest, more honest than she'd been with anyone, maybe even herself. She finished the last stitch and tied it off, then bandaged his hand with clean cloth, her fingers gentle against his skin. There, she said quietly. Keep it clean and dry. Change the bandage every day. It should heal without infection if you're careful. She started to pull away, but Caleb's good hand caught her wrist, holding her in place. She looked up, startled, and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You don't owe anyone gratitude for treating you like a human being, he said. That's just basic decency. And you sure as hell don't owe me anything for giving you work you've more than earned. I know that. Do you? His thumb brushed across the inside of her wrist, so lightly she almost thought she'd imagined it. Because sometimes I think you're still waiting for me to call in the debt, to ask for something you're not willing to give. Maylin's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could feel it through her skin. And you won't? No. His voice was rough, absolutely certain. I won't. They stayed like that, frozen in the afternoon light, his hand around her wrist and her kneeling between his knees, until Maylin finally pulled away and stood, her legs shaking. You should rest, she said, not looking at him. The hand will hurt worse tonight. Maylin, I need to finish the garden. She walked away before he could say whatever he'd been about to say, before the thing building in her chest could crack open and spill out. She went back to the beans and worked until her hands were numb and the sun was setting and she couldn't tell anymore if the wetness on her face was sweat or tears. But that night, neither of them slept well. Caleb's hand throbbed despite the whiskey he'd drunk to dull it, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw Maylin kneeling in front of him, her face grave and beautiful, and so achingly careful it made him want to pull her into his arms and never let go. Maylin lay in her small room and stared at the ceiling, replaying the moment when his hand had caught her wrist, when his thumb had brushed her pulse point, and her entire body had lit up like dry grass catching fire. She'd wanted to stay, wanted to lean into him, press her forehead against his shoulder, feel his arms come around her and hold her like she was something worth keeping. But wanting was dangerous. Wanting led to hoping, and hoping led to heartbreak. She had to be smarter than that. In the morning, they were both careful again, their words polite and their movements deliberate, maintaining the distance that felt less like safety and more like slow suffocation. A week later, Caleb had to ride to a neighboring ranch to help with branding. He'd be gone overnight, maybe 2 days, and he asked Maylin 3 times if she'd be all right alone. I'll be fine, she said for the 3rd time, exasperation creeping into her voice. I managed alone before you. I can manage one night. I know, He stopped, running his good hand through his hair. The stitched one was healing well, thanks to her care. Just keep the doors locked, and if anyone comes around you don't know, don't answer. I'll be careful. He nodded, still reluctant, and finally swung up into the saddle. I'll be back by tomorrow evening. She watched him ride away, and the valley suddenly felt enormous and empty. The day passed quietly. Mei Lin worked the garden, fed the chickens, cleaned the house even though it didn't need cleaning. She made herself supper and ate it alone at the table, the silence pressing in from all sides. By the time darkness fell, she was exhausted but too restless to sleep. She took a lamp and went out to the barn to check on the horses. Storm nickered when she approached, and Mei Lin scratched the yearling's forehead, murmuring soft words in Cantonese. The mare, the one who'd nearly died giving birth, watched from her stall with calm, intelligent eyes. "He worries too much," Mei Lin told them. "I've survived worse than being alone for one night." But as she said it, she realized it wasn't true anymore. She'd gotten used to Caleb's presence, the steady rhythm of his footsteps, the sound of his voice, the knowledge that someone was there. The solitude that had once felt normal now felt wrong, like a coat that no longer fit. She was heading back to the house when she heard hoofbeats. Her first thought was that Caleb had changed his mind and come back. But these were multiple horses, moving fast, and there were voices, rough, male, slurred with drink. Mei Lin's blood went cold. She doused the lamp and pressed herself against the barn wall, her heart hammering. 3 riders came into the yard, their horses stamping and blowing. In the moonlight, she recognized one of them, one of Blackwell's freight workers, the thick-necked man who'd stood beside him at the church social. The other 2 she didn't know, but they had the same hard, mean look. "Boone?" one of them called out. "You home?" Silence. The house was dark, the windows blank. "Guess not," another said, his words slurring together. "But the Chinaman's woman might be." They laughed, and the sound made Mei Lin's skin crawl. "Let's have a look around," the first one said. "See what Boone's got worth taking." They dismounted, and Mei Lin watched in growing horror as they approached the house. One of them tried the door, locked, thank God, and then moved to a window. She heard glass breaking, heard them laughing, and knew she had seconds to decide. She could hide in the barn and hope they didn't find her. Or she could run. She ran. She slipped out the back of the barn and headed for the creek, moving as quietly as she could through the darkness. Behind her, she heard more glass breaking, heard them calling to each other, their voices ugly with liquor and intent. The creek was swollen from summer rains, running fast and cold. Mei Lin waded in up to her knees, then her waist, the current pulling at her skirts, and crossed to the far side where the willows grew thick. She pushed into the shadows and crouched there, shivering, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. She could see the house from here, see the men moving inside with lanterns, silhouetted against the windows. They were tearing through her home, through Caleb's home, taking what they wanted, destroying what they couldn't carry. And there was nothing she could do. She stayed in the willows until the men finally left, their horses loaded with supplies, their laughter echoing across the valley. She stayed until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely and the night was silent again except for the rush of the creek. Then she waded back across and walked to the house on legs that barely held her. The damage was worse than she'd feared. Windows broken, furniture overturned, the pantry ransacked. They'd taken food, tools, anything of value they could carry. But worse than the theft was the deliberate destruction. Flour scattered across the floor, jars smashed, Caleb's clothes pulled from the wardrobe and trampled. In her room, they'd torn through her few possessions, broken her mirror, shredded the quilt she'd been mending. And on the wall, written in what looked like lamp oil, were 2 words: "Poor house." Mei Lin stood in the doorway and felt something break inside her that she didn't know how to fix. She spent the rest of the night cleaning, not because it would undo what had happened, but because she needed to do something with her hands, needed to feel like she had some control. She swept up glass and flour and broken crockery. She scrubbed the words off the wall until her arms ached. She righted furniture and salvaged what she could. By the time dawn came, she was exhausted, filthy, and hollow. And when Caleb rode into the yard just after sunrise, earlier than expected, and saw the broken windows and the scattered debris in the yard, his face went white. He was off his horse before it stopped moving, running toward the house, shouting her name. "Mei Lin! Mei Lin!" She met him in the doorway, and the relief that flooded his face when he saw her was so intense, it was almost painful. "You're all right," he said, his voice shaking. "Thank God you're all right." "They came last night," she said, her voice flat and distant. 3 men. I hid by the creek. They took supplies and—" her voice cracked.
They destroyed things. Caleb's jaw clenched, his eyes sweeping over the damage visible through the open door. Did they hurt you? Did they touch you? No, I hid. They didn't find me.
He reached for her then, his hands hovering near her shoulders as if he was afraid she might shatter. Mei-Lin, I cleaned what I could, she continued, not letting him finish. Most of the food stores are gone, some tools, they broke windows, furniture. I can fix some of it, but I don't care about the windows or the furniture. His voice was fierce now, controlled fury barely leashed. I care that you were here alone and 3 men came to my house and terrorized you, and I wasn't here to stop it. It's not your fault. The hell it isn't. He stepped back, his hand going to his hair in frustration. I should have stayed. Should have known Blackwell would try something. You think he sent them? I know he did. Caleb's eyes were hard as flint. He's been looking for a way to punish me since the church social. This is it.
Mei-Lin felt something cold settle in her stomach. Then he'll do it again. Not if I have anything to say about it. What are you going to do? Caleb looked at her, and she saw something in his face that made her breath catch. Not anger, though there was plenty of that, but determination as absolute as bedrock. I'm going to town, he said, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what happened here. Then I'm going to the sheriff, and if he won't do anything, I'll handle it myself. Caleb, no, I told you that you were under my protection. His voice was quiet now, but it carried the weight of an oath. I meant it, and everyone in Copperfield is going to understand what that means. He started to turn away, but Mei-Lin caught his arm, her fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt. Please don't do something you'll regret, she said. Not for me. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face, and what she saw in his eyes made her knees weak. The only thing I'd regret, he said softly, is if I let this stand. If I let them think they can come to my home and hurt what's mine and get away with it. I'm not yours. The words came out before she could stop them, defensive and sharp, and she saw them land like a blow. Caleb's expression didn't change, but something shuddered in his eyes. No, he agreed quietly. You're not, but this is still your home, and you still deserve to be safe in it. That doesn't change just because we haven't put a name to whatever this is between us. He pulled gently free of her grip and walked to his horse, swinging up into the saddle with controlled precision. Stay inside, he said. Lock the doors. I'll be back before dark. And then he was gone, riding hard toward town, leaving Mei-Lin standing in the doorway of a broken house with her heart in her throat and the terrible certainty that everything was about to change. Mei-Lin stood in the doorway long after the dust from Caleb's horse had settled, her arms wrapped around herself against a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The words she'd thrown at him, I'm not yours, echoed in her head like an accusation, and she didn't know if she'd said them because they were true or because she was afraid of how much she wanted them to be false. She turned back to the wreckage of the house and forced herself to keep working. There was glass to sweep, furniture to right, a life to piece back together. Her hands moved mechanically, but her mind was 7 miles away, following Caleb into town, imagining what he might do, what might happen when anger met pride in the dusty streets of Copperfield. She was scrubbing the last of the oil stain from her bedroom wall when she heard a wagon approaching. Her heart seized, too soon for Caleb to be back, too heavy for a single rider. She grabbed the shotgun Caleb kept by the door, checked that it was loaded the way he'd shown her weeks ago, and positioned herself where she could see the yard without being easily seen. But the wagon that rolled up carried Reverend Michaels and his wife, Ruth, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and flour permanently dusted into the creases of her apron. Behind them came 2 more wagons, the Hendersons, who owned the farm east of town, and the Pritchards, an older couple Mei-Lin had seen at the church social. Reverend Michaels climbed down and approached the house with his hands visible, his expression gentle. Mrs. Chen? It's Reverend Michaels. Caleb sent word about what happened. We've come to help. Mei-Lin lowered the shotgun slowly, disbelief warring with something dangerously close to hope. She stepped onto the porch, and Ruth Michaels took one look at her face and the broken windows behind her and came forward with the kind of purposeful compassion that couldn't be refused. "Oh, you poor dear," she said, not waiting for permission before wrapping Mei-Lin in a brief, fierce hug that smelled like bread and lavender.
No one should have to face something like this alone. Come now, show us what needs doing. Within an hour, the yard was full of purposeful activity. Mr. Henderson and Reverend Michaels measured windows for new glass and began repairs to the frames. Mrs. Pritchard and Ruth worked alongside May Lynn inside, salvaging food that hadn't been ruined, scrubbing floors, washing linens. Young Thomas Henderson, all of 15 and eager to prove himself useful, mucked out the barn and repaired Storm's stall door, which had been kicked in during the raid. They worked without asking questions that would shame her, without casting judgment, and May Lynn felt something crack open in her chest that had been sealed tight since Jacob died. These were Caleb's people, not hers, not yet. But they came anyway because he'd asked them to, because what had happened was wrong, and they knew it. Ruth found her in the kitchen around midday, staring at the empty pantry shelves. "We brought supplies," the older woman said gently, "enough to restock what was taken. And Martha Henderson is sending over preserves and smoked ham tomorrow." "Why?" The word escaped before May Lynn could stop it. "Why are you helping me?" Ruth's smile was sad and knowing. "Because Caleb Boone is a good man who doesn't ask for help unless he truly needs it. Because what happened here was an act of cruelty and cowardice. And because—" she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Because you matter to him, Mrs. Chen. Anyone with eyes can see that, which means you matter to us." Mayleen's throat closed. "The town doesn't think that. Most of them think I shouldn't be here at all. Most of the town doesn't know you. They're scared of what's different, scared of change. But there are more good people in Copperfield than bad ones. They just need someone to remind them of it." Ruth touched her arm lightly. "Caleb's doing that right now. And you, my dear, have been doing it every day, just by living your life with dignity." Before May Lynn could respond, they heard horses approaching fast, multiple riders, moving with purpose. Everyone in the yard stopped working, tension crackling through the air like lightning before a storm. But it was Caleb who rode in first, followed by Sheriff Porter, a grizzled man in his 50s with a tin star pinned to his vest and eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. Behind them came 3 more men, ranchers May Lynn recognized from town but didn't know by name. Caleb dismounted and his eyes found May Lynn immediately, sweeping over her as if checking for injuries he might have missed that morning. When he seemed satisfied she was whole, some of the tension left his shoulders. Sheriff Porter climbed down more slowly, his gaze taking in the broken windows, the people working in the yard, the evidence of violence that couldn't be hidden. "Mrs. Chen," he said, tipping his hat, "I need to hear what happened last night, in your own words." May Lynn told him about the 3 men, the broken windows, hiding in the creek, the destruction she'd found when she returned. She kept her voice steady, her words precise, even when she got to the part about the message on her wall. Porter's expression darkened as she spoke, and when she finished, he turned to Caleb. "And you're certain it was Blackwell's men?" "I'm certain," Caleb said, his voice like iron. "Tom Brennan was one of them. Mrs. Chen recognized him. He works for Blackwell's freight company, has for 3 years. Recognition isn't proof of who sent them. Don't insult both of us by pretending you don't know exactly who's behind this." Caleb's control was fraying, anger bleeding through. "Blackwell's been making threats since the church social. This was retaliation, pure and simple." Porter sighed, rubbing a hand over his weathered face. "What Blackwell's been saying and what he's done are 2 different things in the eyes of the law, Boone. I can bring Brennan in for questioning, but unless Mrs. Chen's willing to testify that she saw him break into this house, my hands are tied." "I saw him," May Lynn said immediately. "You saw his face? In the dark? Clear enough to swear to it in court?" She hesitated, and Porter nodded grimly. "That's what I thought. I believe you, ma'am, but belief isn't evidence. Defense lawyer would tear that apart in minutes." "Then what the hell are we supposed to do?" Caleb's voice rose, frustration and fear warring for dominance. "Wait for them to come back? Wait for someone to get hurt?" "I'm going to talk to Blackwell," Porter said firmly. "Make it clear that I know what happened and that I'll be watching. Sometimes that's enough to put a stop to things. And if it's not, then we deal with it when it comes." Porter's gaze moved to May Lynn, and something in his expression softened. "Mrs. Chen, do you have somewhere else you can stay for a few days? Just until things settle?" "She's staying here," Caleb said before Mei Lin could answer. This is her home. Caleb, no. He turned to face the sheriff fully, and there was something implacable in his stance. She's not being driven out of her own home by threats and vandalism. We'll repair the damage, replace what was stolen, and life goes on. I'm not suggesting she leave permanently, just until what? Until Blackwell gets bored? Until whoever did this decides they've made their point. Caleb shook his head. That's letting them win. I won't do it, and I won't ask Mei Lin to do it either. Porter looked like he wanted to argue, but one of the ranchers who'd ridden in with them, a barrel-chested man named Sullivan, spoke up. Boone's right. Running won't solve this, but he shouldn't face it alone either. He looked at the other men. We could take turns. Night watches, couple of men at a time until the sheriff gets this sorted. The suggestion rippled through the group, and slowly, one by one, the men nodded. Even Reverend Michaels, who Mei Lin suspected had never held a gun in his life, agreed to take a rotation. Caleb's jaw worked, emotion flickering across his face too fast to name. You don't have to do this. We know, Henderson said simply. We're doing it anyway. Porter looked around at the assembled group, and something like approval crossed his features. All right then. I'll go talk to Blackwell, make sure he knows the law's watching. And you all... He fixed them with a hard stare. You keep watch, but you don't go looking for trouble. Someone shows up where they shouldn't be, you defend the property. But no pauses, no vigilante justice. Clear? Everyone nodded, and Porter swung back into his saddle. I'll check back tomorrow, he told Caleb. Keep your head on straight, Boone. After the sheriff left, the work resumed with renewed purpose. By late afternoon, all the windows had been temporarily boarded and measured for glass. The house had been cleaned and restocked, and a schedule had been worked out for the night watches. Ruth Michaels pulled Mei Lin aside before they left and pressed a cloth-wrapped bundle into her hands. Cinnamon rolls, she said with a smile. Fresh this morning. You and Caleb have earned something sweet. Mei Lin's eyes stung. Thank you for everything. You're welcome, dear. And remember, you're not alone in this. Not anymore. As the wagons pulled away and the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Caleb and Mei Lin stood together in the yard, watching the dust settle. The silence between them was heavy with everything that had happened, everything that had been said and left unsaid. You shouldn't have told them to help me, Mei Lin said finally. I didn't tell them. I asked. They chose. Because of you. Not because of me. Caleb turned to look at her, and the exhaustion in his face made him look older, more vulnerable. Does it matter? They helped. The house is repaired. You're safe. Am I? She met his gaze. Those men are still out there. Blackwell is still out there. A few night watches won't change that. No, but it's a start. He moved closer, and she could smell horse and sweat and the dusty scent of the road. Mei Lin, what I said this morning about you being under my protection, I meant it. But I need to know if that's what you want. Because if it's not, if you'd rather leave, find somewhere safer, I'll help you do that. I'll give you money, references, whatever you need. I won't keep you here if staying means living in fear. Mei Lin stared at him, this man who'd already given her so much and was offering to give her more, even if it meant losing her. And she realized with startling clarity that she was tired of running, tired of being afraid, tired of building walls to protect a heart that was already breaking. I don't want to leave, she said quietly. Something in Caleb's expression shifted, relief, hope, something deeper that made her pulse quicken. You're sure? I'm sure. Even though it's dangerous, even though people will talk and judge and make your life harder? Yes. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, the fine lines at their corners, the barely healed cut on his palm. I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions. I'm tired of running from the possibility of being hurt. And I'm tired of pretending that this... She gestured between them, at the space that felt charged with electricity. That this is nothing. Caleb went very still. What is it then? I don't know yet. The honesty of it surprised her. But I want to find out. If you do. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his chest rising and falling with careful breaths. Then, slowly,
He lifted his hand and brushed his fingers against her cheek, so gently she barely felt it. I do, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I've wanted that since the night Storm was born. Maybe longer.
Maylene's breath caught, and before she could talk herself out of it, before fear could reassert its grip, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was brief and chaste and tentative, her lips barely brushing his, but it felt like jumping off a cliff into unknown water, terrifying and exhilarating and utterly inevitable. When she pulled back, Caleb's eyes were closed, his expression almost pained. He opened them slowly, and what she saw there made her knees weak. Maylene, he whispered, if we do this, if we start down this road, I need you to know I'm not good at halfway. When I care about something, I care all the way, and I already care about you more than I know how to say. Then don't say it. She took his hand, the one she'd stitched, and pressed it against her cheek. Show me instead. He kissed her then, really kissed her, and it was nothing like the careful brush of lips she'd initiated. It was deep and consuming and full of months of wanting kept carefully leashed. His hands came up to frame her face, gentle despite their roughness, and she gripped his shirt like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the sun had nearly set, and the first stars were emerging in the darkening sky. We should go inside, Caleb said, his forehead resting against hers. Sullivan and his boy will be here in an hour for first watch. All right. But neither of them moved. They stood there in the gathering darkness, holding each other like they'd found something precious and breakable and worth protecting at any cost. The night watches continued for a week. Different men came each evening, ranchers and farmers, the blacksmith, even young Thomas Henderson, who sat on the porch with a rifle he barely knew how to use and a determination that was almost comical. No one came to cause trouble, but the presence of the guards sent a message that rippled through Copperfield. Caleb Boone had allies, and anyone who threatened what was his would answer to more than just one man. Blackwell, for his part, went quiet. Sheriff Porter reported that he'd denied any involvement in the attack, claimed his men had been in town that night at the Saloon, and presented witnesses who swore to it. The witnesses were liars. Everyone knew it, but proving it was another matter. Let it go, Porter advised Caleb when he came by to check on things. I know it sticks in your throat, but sometimes the best revenge is just living well and letting the bastards choke on their own bile. Caleb didn't like it, but he accepted it. Mostly because Maylene asked him to. I don't want you risking yourself for vengeance, she told him one evening as they sat on the porch after Sullivan had arrived for his watch. What happened was terrible, but we survived it. We're stronger now. That's enough. Is it? It has to be. She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. Otherwise, we're just letting them win in a different way, letting them make us bitter and angry and afraid. I won't give them that power. So they let it go. Or rather, they redirected that energy into rebuilding, into making the ranch not just functional, but beautiful. Caleb ordered real glass for the windows and installed them himself with a care that bordered on reverence. Maylene sewed curtains from fabric Ruth Michaels brought her, delicate white cotton that filtered the sunlight into something soft and golden. They replanted the garden together, worked side by side in the earth, and at night they sat on the porch and talked about things they'd never told anyone else. Caleb told her about his brother, about the fever that had taken him so fast there hadn't even been time to say goodbye, about the guilt he still carried for surviving when Thomas hadn't. Maylene told him about the merchant's house in San Francisco, about the casual cruelties of a family who'd seen her as property, about the shame of being sold and the fierce pride of having survived it anyway. They learned each other slowly, carefully, like cartographers mapping unknown territory. And with each story shared, each secret revealed, the distance between them shrank until it was almost nothing. But they were careful with the physical distance. After that first kiss in the yard, they'd pulled back by unspoken agreement, both of them understanding that there were things that needed to be addressed first. Practicalities. Futures. What people would say and what it would mean. It was Maylene who finally brought it up, 3 weeks after the attack. They were in the kitchen cleaning up after supper when she said, "We need to talk about what happens next." Caleb set down the plate he'd been drying and turned to face her. "All right, people already think that we're improper. If they knew the truth, that we're..." She paused, searching for the right word. That recording, I suppose, it would only make things worse. Probably. It would hurt your reputation. I don't care about my reputation. You should. She turned to face him fully, her expression serious. You've lived here for years, built relationships, earned respect. I don't want to be the reason you lose that. Caleb crossed the small space between them and took her hands. Maylin, I spent 12 years building this ranch into something I could be proud of. But you want to know what I realized these past few months? It doesn't mean anything if I'm still living in it alone. I don't want respect if it comes at the cost of being with you. But let me finish. His grip on her hands tightened slightly. I know what people will say. I know it'll be hard, probably harder than either of us can imagine right now. But I also know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, and I'm not willing to pretend otherwise just to make other people comfortable. Maylin's eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to marry you. The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water, sending ripples in every direction. Maylin's breath caught, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Caleb, I know it's fast. I know there are 100 reasons why it's complicated, but I also know that every morning I wake up and you're here, and every night I fall asleep knowing you're safe under this roof, and that's the closest thing to peace I've ever known. He lifted one of her hands to his lips, kissed her knuckles gently. Marry me, Maylin. Not because you owe me anything, not because you need protection or security, but because you want to, because you feel what I feel. Maylin looked at him, really looked at him, and saw everything he was offering laid bare. Not rescue, not charity, but partnership, respect, love that didn't demand gratitude or submission, but simply asked to be returned. Yes, she whispered. Caleb blinked as if he hadn't quite heard her. Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. The tears came then, spilling down her cheeks even as she smiled. I feel what you feel. I have for weeks. I was just too afraid to admit it. He pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair, his body shaking with emotion he'd kept locked down for too long. Thank you, he murmured against her temple. Thank you. They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other while the lamps burned low and the night settled around them, and for the first time in her life, Maylin felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Well, they were married 3 days later in Reverend Michael's small church, with Ruth as witness and Sullivan standing up as Caleb's second. Maylin wore the blue dress from the church social, the best she owned, and Caleb wore his Sunday suit that still smelled faintly of cedar from the trunk where it had been stored. The ceremony was simple and brief, but when Caleb slipped a plain gold band onto her finger, his mother's ring saved all these years, and promised to honor and cherish her for the rest of his days, Maylin felt the last of her walls crumble. I promise the same, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. For the rest of my days. When Reverend Michaels pronounced them husband and wife and told Caleb he could kiss his bride, the kiss was soft and reverent and full of promises they'd spend a lifetime keeping. The news spread through Copperfield like wildfire. Some people were shocked, some were scandalized, a few were genuinely happy for them. But Caleb and Maylin Boone now, she reminded herself with a thrill, didn't care. They drove back to the ranch in the afternoon sunshine, and when they crossed the threshold of the house together, Caleb swept her into his arms and carried her over as tradition demanded. Welcome home, Mrs. Boone, he said, setting her down gently. Maylin looked around at the house they'd rebuilt together, at the curtains she'd sewn and the furniture they'd repaired and the life they'd created from the ruins of what came before. I'm already home, she said. I have been for months. I just didn't know it yet. That night they lay together in Caleb's bed, their bed now, and talked until the stars wheeled overhead and the mountains turned silver with moonlight. They talked about the future, about expanding the herd and maybe adding onto the house, about children someday if they were blessed with them, about growing old together in this valley they both loved. And when words finally failed and sleep began to pull at them, Caleb pulled Maylin closer and pressed a kiss to her forehead. I love you, he said quietly. I should have said it before. I love you. Maylin's heart swelled until she thought it might burst.
I love you too. She felt him smile against her hair, felt his arms tighten around her, and knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, whatever challenges or hardships or joys the future held, they would face it together. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The first week of their marriage passed in a haze of quiet joy that felt almost fragile, as if speaking too loudly might shatter it. Caleb worked the ranch with renewed purpose, and Mei Lin found herself humming while she worked the garden, a habit she'd forgotten she had. They learned the rhythms of sharing space as husband and wife. Small intimacies like passing coffee cups at dawn, brushing hands while washing dishes, the warmth of another body in bed after years of sleeping alone. But the peace was temporary, and they both knew it. The first crack came on a Thursday morning when Caleb rode into town for supplies. He returned 3 hours later, his jaw tight and his eyes hard, and Mei Lin knew immediately that something had happened. "What is it?" she asked, meeting him as he dismounted. He handed her a folded piece of paper without a word. She opened it and felt ice slide through her veins. It was a notice from the Territorial Land Office, stamped official and signed by a clerk she'd never heard of. The language was dense and legal, but the meaning was clear enough. A claim had been filed against Caleb's water rights to Bitter Creek. The filing party was listed as Marcus Blackwell, represented by attorney Howard Finch out of Cheyenne. "He can't do this," Mei Lin said, her voice shaking with anger. "You've had water rights for 12 years. Prior claim doesn't matter if someone challenges it with the right documentation." Caleb took the notice back, his knuckles white against the paper. "Blackwell's claiming he purchased riparian rights from the original territorial survey in 1875, before I filed my claim. Says I've been using water I had no legal access to. Is it true?" "No, but proving it false means going through the land office, hiring a lawyer, digging up 12-year-old paperwork that might not even exist anymore." He crumpled the notice in his fist. "It's a game. He knows I can't afford to fight this the way he can. He's got money for lawyers and bribes and whatever else it takes. He's trying to bleed me dry." Mei Lin felt fury rise in her chest, hot and righteous. "Because of me. Because you married me. Because he's a vindictive bastard who can't stand that someone told him no." Caleb's voice was rough with frustration. "This isn't your fault, Mei Lin." "It is. If you hadn't helped me, if you hadn't, then I'd still be alone in this house, and you'd be working yourself to death in Blackwell's freight yard, and neither of us would be happy." He pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers. "I don't regret a single choice I made. Not one. But I need to figure out how to fight this before it destroys everything we've built." That evening, Sullivan and Henderson came by after Caleb sent word. They sat around the kitchen table, the land office notice spread between them, and tried to find a way through the maze Blackwell had constructed. "You need a lawyer," Sullivan said bluntly. "Someone who knows territorial law and isn't afraid to go up against Finch." "That costs money I don't have," Caleb replied. "Every cent I've saved has gone into improving the ranch. I can't pull together lawyer fees and keep the operation running." Henderson studied the notice, his weathered face creased with thought. "What if we pooled resources? 5 or 6 of us, enough to hire someone decent. We all use Bitter Creek downstream from you. If Blackwell wins this claim, he could cut off water to half the valley." "He's right," Sullivan agreed. "This isn't just about you anymore, Boone. Blackwell's testing how much he can take. We let him win here. He'll come for the rest of us next." Caleb looked between them, something vulnerable flickering across his face. "I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. We're offering." Henderson reached across and gripped Caleb's shoulder. "You stood up for what's right. Now let us stand with you." The decision was made. By week's end, 7 ranchers had contributed funds, and Reverend Michaels had sent word to a lawyer in Laramie he'd known years ago. A man named Samuel Grant, who had a reputation for taking on powerful interests and winning. Grant arrived 2 weeks later, a lean man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a manner that suggested he suffered fools poorly. He spent 3 days examining Caleb's paperwork, riding the property to survey the creek, and asking questions that seemed tangential until he wove them together into a narrative. "Blackwell's claim is bullshit," he announced on the 3rd evening, sitting at the Boone's table with documents spread around him. "The survey he's referencing does exist, but the riparian rights were never sold. They defaulted to the territorial government, which means when you filed your homestead claim and water rights in 1876, you did so legally.
Blackwell's trying to backdoor a purchase through a clerk who probably doesn't know any better. Can you prove it? Caleb asked. I can, but it'll require going to the land office in Cheyenne, pulling original surveys, and possibly deposing the clerk who filed Blackwell's claim. Grant leaned back, his expression calculating. It won't be cheap and it won't be fast. Blackwell will drag this out as long as he can, hoping you'll run out of money or patience. How long are we talking? 3 months? Maybe 4. Caleb's face went pale. That takes us into late fall. If we don't have water access during that time, you'll have access. I'll file an injunction tomorrow keeping things status quo until the dispute is resolved. Grant's gaze moved to Mei Lin, who'd been listening silently from her place by the stove. Mrs. Boone, do you have any legal claim to property or assets separate from your husband? Mei Lin blinked, surprised to be addressed. No. Everything I had was lost when my first husband died. What about debts? Any outstanding obligations? No. My husband's debts were settled. She glanced at Caleb, something passing between them. Completely settled. Grant made a note. Good. Blackwell might try to attack your marriage as a way to undermine Caleb's character. The fewer complications, the better. He stood, gathering his papers. I'll head to Cheyenne tomorrow and start the process. In the meantime, document everything. Every interaction with Blackwell. Every unusual occurrence. If he tries intimidation or sabotage, I want records. After Grant left, Caleb and Mei Lin sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge. The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on them both. 4 months, Caleb said quietly. 4 months of not knowing if we'll still have a ranch at the end of it. We'll have each other. Mei Lin took his hand. That's what matters. Is it enough? If we lose this place, if we have to start over somewhere else, then we start over. She turned to face him. Caleb, I've lost everything before. Home, security, people I cared about. It was terrifying, but I survived. And this time I won't be alone. Neither will you. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. I don't want to lose this. I built it for... He stopped, his voice catching. For what? For this? For you. For the family I hoped I'd have someday. He pulled back enough to look at her. I know we've only been married a few weeks. I know it's too soon. But I need you to know that when I look at this place, I see our future. Children running in the yard, grandchildren maybe. A life that means something because we built it together. Mei Lin felt tears prick her eyes. I see it too. And we're not going to lose it. We're going to fight, and we're going to win, because we have something Blackwell doesn't. What's that? People who actually care about us. She smiled through her tears. He has money and lawyers. We have community, and in the end, I think that's stronger. The next 2 months tested that belief in ways neither of them anticipated. Blackwell escalated. Fences on the boundary between his land and Caleb's were cut, allowing cattle to wander. Equipment left in the fields went missing. One of the water troughs was poisoned, killing 3 head of cattle before Caleb discovered it. Each incident was small enough to be dismissed as bad luck or accident, but the pattern was clear. Sheriff Porter investigated each complaint, but evidence was always scarce and witnesses non-existent. Blackwell maintained his innocence with a smugness that made Caleb's blood boil. But the community rallied. Henderson helped replace the poisoned cattle at cost. Sullivan organized rotating patrols of the property line. Ruth Michaels coordinated a network of ranch wives who kept watch during the day, documenting every stranger who passed through the valley. It wasn't enough to stop all the harassment, but it was enough to blunt its impact. Mei Lin threw herself into keeping the household running. She preserved everything the garden produced, managed the chickens and the dairy cow Caleb had purchased in spring, and learned to shoot well enough that Caleb trusted her to defend the property if needed. At night, she kept the books, tracking every expense and income with meticulous care, looking for ways to stretch their dwindling resources. The strain wore on them both. Caleb grew quieter, more withdrawn, the weight of responsibility carving new lines into his face. Mei Lin found herself lying awake at night, listening to him breathe, feeling the tension in his body even in sleep. One evening in early October, she found him in the barn, sitting in Storm's stall with his head in his hands. The yearling stood nearby, nuzzling his shoulder with gentle concern. Caleb? He looked up, and she saw exhaustion and fear warring in his expression. "We got a letter from Grant today. Blackwell's lawyers are filing for delays, could push the hearing back another 2 months." Mei Lin's stomach dropped. "Can they do that?" "Apparently." He laughed, bitter and sharp. "We're running out of money, Mei Lin. Even with everyone's help, even with cutting every corner, we're barely holding on. Another 2 months and we'll have to start selling cattle just to pay the legal fees. And if we do that, we'll rebuild the herd later." "You don't understand. This ranch, it's everything I—" His voice broke. "I'm failing. I'm failing you, failing everyone who trusted me, failing my brother's memory. He died so I could have this chance, and I'm watching it slip away because I was stupid enough to make an enemy of Marcus Blackwell." Mei Lin crossed to him and knelt in the straw, taking his face in her hands. "Look at me." He did, reluctantly. "You are not failing," she said fiercely. "You are fighting. There's a difference. And you're not doing it because you were stupid. You're doing it because you chose to be kind when cruelty was easier, because you chose me when it would have been simpler to walk away. That's not failure, Caleb. That's courage. Courage doesn't pay lawyers or feed cattle. No, but it builds something stronger than money ever could." She pressed her forehead to his. "We will get through this. And if we lose the ranch, we'll find another way, but we will not lose each other. I won't let that happen." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she felt wetness against her neck that might have been tears. They stayed there in the barn until full dark, holding each other while Storm kept watch. And when they finally walked back to the house, hand in hand, something had shifted. The fear was still there, but it no longer had the power to break them. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In mid-October, a rider arrived at the ranch, a young man with ink-stained fingers and nervous energy who introduced himself as Peter Walsh, a clerk from the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. "I need to speak with you and Mr. Grant," he said, his eyes darting around as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows. "It's about Marcus Blackwell's claim." Grant was summoned, and they gathered in the kitchen. Walsh pulled a folder from his satchel with shaking hands. "I'm the one who filed Blackwell's claim," he said without preamble. "Or rather, I processed the paperwork he submitted. I didn't think much of it at the time. Seemed legitimate enough. But then Mr. Grant started pulling records, asking questions, and I realized something was wrong." Grant leaned forward. "What did you realize?" "The survey Blackwell referenced? It exists. But the riparian rights notation was added later. Much later." "What?" Walsh opened the folder, revealing 2 documents side by side. "This is a certified copy of the original 1875 survey. No mention of water rights being sold. And this is the version Blackwell submitted with his claim. See here?" He pointed to a handwritten notation in the margin. "That's not original. The ink is different, the handwriting doesn't match the surveyor's style, and it's positioned in a way that suggests it was added after the fact." "He forged it," Mei Lin breathed. "Or had someone forge it for him." Walsh looked sick. "I should have caught it. I'm trained to spot these things. But Blackwell came in with a lawyer, very official, very confident, and I was new, didn't want to make waves." He met Caleb's eyes. "I'm sorry. This never should have gotten this far." Grant's expression was carefully neutral. "Why are you telling us this now?" "Because it's not right, and because yesterday, Blackwell's lawyer came to see me, offered me money to lose the original survey. A lot of money." Walsh's jaw set. "I said no, but I know him. He'll find another way. So I copied everything, certified it myself, and brought it here before he could." "You could lose your job for this," Caleb said. "I know, but I'll lose my conscience if I don't." Walsh pushed the folder toward Grant. "This is everything you need to prove fraud. Use it." Grant took the folder, his eyes scanning the documents with growing intensity. Then he looked up, and for the first time since they'd met him, he smiled. "Mr. Walsh, you just won this case." The hearing was held 3 weeks later in Cheyenne, in a cramped office that smelled of old paper and tobacco smoke. Blackwell attended with Howard Finch, both men radiating confidence that evaporated the moment Grant presented Walsh's evidence. The land office adjudicator, a stern woman named Margaret Chen, who was absolutely no relation to Mei Lin, despite the shared surname, examined the documents with methodical care. She compared ink, studied handwriting, consulted the original survey ledgers. Then she looked at Blackwell with an expression that could have frozen water. "Mr. Blackwell, this notation is fraudulent. The evidence is incontrovertible." Finch stood immediately. "We were provided these documents in good faith by whom?" Chen interrupted. "Because someone committed fraud, Mr. Finch. Either your client did, or someone acting on his behalf did. Either way, this claim is not only denied, it's being referred to the territorial prosecutor for investigation." Blackwell's face went purple. "This is outrageous. I have rights." "You have the right to remain silent before you incriminate yourself further." Chen stamped the file with decisive force. "Mr. Boone's water rights are hereby confirmed in full. This office apologizes for the time and expense wasted on this spurious claim. And Mr. Blackwell?" She fixed him with a look that could have melted steel. "If you ever file another fraudulent claim in this territory, I will personally ensure you face the maximum penalties available under the law. Are we clear?" Blackwell stormed out without answering, Finch hurrying after him. Grant stood and shook Caleb's hand. "Congratulations. It's over." Caleb felt like he couldn't breathe, couldn't quite process that they'd won. He looked at Mei Lin, who was sitting beside him with tears streaming down her face, and felt his own eyes sting. "Thank you," he managed to say to Grant, "for everything. Thank Mr. Walsh. He's the one who made this possible." Grant gathered his papers. "I'll send my final invoice next week. Given the fraud finding, you might even be able to recover costs from Blackwell, though I wouldn't hold my breath." They walked out of the building into bright November sunshine, and Caleb stopped on the steps, pulling Mei Lin into his arms. "We did it," he said, his voice shaking. "We actually did it. We did." She pulled back to look at him, her smile radiant despite the tears. "Can we go home now?" "Yeah." He kissed her forehead. "Let's go home." They arrived back at the ranch 3 days later to find the yard full of wagons. Sullivan, Henderson, the Pritchards, Reverend Michaels and Ruth, and a dozen other families had gathered, and when Caleb and Mei Lin climbed down from their wagon, a cheer went up that probably carried all the way to Copperfield. Ruth rushed forward and hugged Mei Lin hard enough to steal her breath. "We heard! Walsh sent a telegraph. Oh, my dear, we're so happy for you both." The celebration lasted until dark. Food and music and laughter that felt like medicine after months of tension. Children ran through the yard while adults shared stories and made toasts to justice and friendship. Storm pranced around, soaking up attention, and even the cattle seemed to sense the mood, lowing contentedly from the pastures. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Sullivan pulled Caleb aside. "There's something you should know," he said quietly. "Blackwell left Copperfield yesterday, packed up his business, sold the freight company to a group from Laramie, and headed east. Word is the prosecutor's investigation scared him enough to run before formal charges could be filed." Caleb absorbed this, feeling something loosen in his chest. "So it's really over?" "Seems like it." Sullivan clapped him on the shoulder. "You and Mei Lin can finally just live without looking over your shoulders." That night, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet again, Caleb and Mei Lin stood on the porch, looking out at their land. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky blazing with stars, and the creek sang its endless song through the valley. "I have something to tell you," Mei Lin said softly. Caleb turned to look at her, and something in her expression made his heart skip. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them, enormous and perfect and terrifying. Caleb felt like he'd been struck by lightning, shocked, electrified, utterly transformed. We're... He couldn't finish the sentence. "I wasn't sure until the doctor in Cheyenne confirmed it. I wanted to wait until everything was settled before I told you. I didn't want to add more worry." She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby, Caleb, next summer." He dropped to his knees, his arms going around her waist, his face pressed against her middle. She felt his shoulders shake and knew he was crying, great silent sobs of relief and joy and overwhelming gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered against the fabric of her dress. "Thank you." Mei Lin ran her fingers through his hair, her own tears falling freely now. "For what?" "For staying, for fighting, for choosing this, for choosing me. He looked up at her, his face wet and open, and more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it, for giving me everything I never thought I'd have. She pulled him to his feet and kissed him, soft and deep, and full of promises that stretched into a future neither of them had dared to imagine 6 months ago. "We gave each other everything," she said. "That's what love does." Winter came to the valley with the first snow in late November, and the Boone Ranch settled into the quiet rhythms of the cold season. Caleb prepared the cattle for winter, reinforced shelters, stocked supplies. Maylin sewed tiny clothes from scraps of fabric, her hands moving with a contentment she'd never known. They learned that Walsh had been promoted rather than fired, his honesty impressing the land office enough to fast-track his career. Grant sent word that Blackwell was facing charges in Kansas for a similar fraud scheme, suggesting his pattern of deception had finally caught up with him. On Christmas Eve, they attended service at Reverend Michael's church, and when Caleb stood with Mei Lin at his side, her hand in his and her belly just beginning to show, he felt the stares and whispers but no longer cared. The people who mattered, the ones who'd stood with them when it counted, smiled and nodded and made space for them in the pews. After the service, Ruth pulled Mei Lin aside. "I have something for you," she said, handing her a wrapped bundle. "Open it when you get home." That night, by lamplight, Mei Lin unwrapped the bundle to find a quilt. A beautiful, intricate creation in blues and golds, every stitch perfect, every square telling a story. "The women made it," Mei Lin said, her voice thick with emotion. "All of them. Look, this square has Ruth's initials, and this one is Martha Henderson's pattern." Caleb touched the fabric gently. "For the baby." "For our baby." She looked at him, her eyes shining. "We have a family now, a real one." "We always did," Caleb said. "We just needed time to find them." They spread the quilt across their bed, and that night they slept beneath it, wrapped in the warmth of community and love and the certainty that they'd built something that would last. Spring returned with the kind of explosive beauty that made you forgive winter's harshness. The creek ran high and fast, the meadows turned green overnight, and Storm, now a sleek young horse with her mother's intelligence and her own wild spirit, followed Caleb everywhere like a devoted shadow. Maylin's belly grew round and full, and Caleb treated her like spun glass, fussing until she threatened to make him sleep in the barn if he didn't let her work the garden. "I'm pregnant, not broken," she informed him after he'd tried to carry her over a puddle. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I can handle a few vegetables." But she secretly loved his protectiveness, the way his hand would rest on her belly at night, the way he'd talk to the baby about the ranch and the horses and the life they were building. In late June, on a morning when the valley was soft with mist and birdsong, Maylin's water broke. Ruth and Martha Henderson came immediately when Caleb rode for them, moving with calm efficiency while Caleb paced the porch like a caged animal. The birth was long, nearly 12 hours, and more than once Caleb tried to break down the door because Maylin's cries were tearing him apart. But when the sun was setting and the mountains turned gold, a new sound joined the chorus of the valley, a baby's cry, fierce and strong and absolutely perfect. Ruth opened the door, her face glowing. "You have a daughter." Caleb stumbled into the room and saw Mei Lin propped against pillows, exhausted and radiant, holding a tiny red-faced creature wrapped in the community quilt. She looked up at him and smiled, and he thought his heart might actually stop. "Come meet your daughter," she said softly. He crossed to them on shaking legs and looked down at the baby, at her screwed-up face and dark hair and tiny, perfect fingers. She opened her eyes, and they were gray, storm-colored, his eyes. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You're both beautiful." "What should we name her?" Mei Lin asked. Caleb thought of everything that had brought them to this moment, the storm that had brought Storm into the world, the storms they'd weathered together, the calm that had followed. "Hope," he said. "Her name is Hope." Mei Lin's smile widened, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Hope Boone, it's perfect." He sat on the edge of the bed and put his arms around them both, his wife, his daughter, his family, and felt a completeness so profound it defied description. Outside, the valley spread before them in all its wild beauty, the ranch they'd fought for, the land they'd defended, the home they'd built from nothing but determination and faith. And in the years to come, there would be more children, 2 sons and another daughter, and the house would ring with laughter and chaos and love. There would be hardships too, because life always brought them, but they would face each one together, their foundation too strong to shake. But in that moment, with the sunset painting the mountains gold and his daughter sleeping in her mother's arms, Caleb Boone allowed himself to simply feel grateful for the chance he'd taken on a desperate woman in a dusty street, for her courage in staying when leaving would have been easier, for the community that had rallied when they needed it most. "I love you," he said to Mei Lin, the words inadequate but true. "I love you too." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Thank you for seeing me that day, for not looking away. Thank you for letting me." They sat together as darkness fell and the stars emerged, and the ranch settled into night with the addition of one new heartbeat, one new life, one new promise that love, real, hard-earned, fought for love, was worth every struggle it took to protect. In the valley where Bitter Creek sang its song and the mountains stood eternal watch, the Boone family had found their place. Not because it had been given to them, but because they'd claimed it with courage and built it with their own hands. And in the end, that made all the difference.